enemy was not only Al-Qaeda itself, but the states that support and shield it, and he would commit the American military to oust Al-Qaeda's primary sponsor, the regime run by the Taliban, from Afghanistan to achieve his goals. At the same time, Bush was compelled to contemplate the direction terrorism might take in the future. This time the weapon of choice had been the airplane. What might it be next time? The nation got a hint when 5 people died and 18 were infected as a result of mysterious envelopes laced with powdered anthrax. Anthrax was one of the substances that had come to be known collectively as weapons of mass destruction, a term that covered the waterfront from biological agents like anthrax to chemical agents like sarin to nuclear bombs. The need to prevent the use of a weapon of mass destruction by a terrorist group widened the scope of the war on terror. Bush came to focus on so-called rogue states that had aggressively sought and made such weapons and seemed as though they would be nearly without constraint when it might come to passing them along. He determined it would not be sufficient to fight Al-Qaeda. America had to confront the rogue states as well, and that led directly to Iraq. It was the only one of those countries that had consciously and consistently defied its own legal obligation, under the terms that ended the 1991 Persian Gulf War, to end any and all efforts to create such weapons. The natural terrorist hunger to acquire WMDs and Saddam Hussein's desire to humiliate the United States combined to make Iraq a new kind of threat to America and to the world. The new threat required nothing less than a new doctrine, a subject Bush began to explore in a speech at West Point in June 2002. Quote, "Deterrence, the promise of massive retaliation against nations, means nothing against shadowy terrorist networks with no nation or citizens to defend," the president said. "Containment is not possible when unbalanced dictators with weapons of mass destruction can deliver those weapons on missiles or secretly provide them to terrorist allies. If we wait for threats to fully materialize, we will have waited too long." The war Bush waged against the regime of Saddam Hussein beginning in March 2003 was therefore an integral part of his war on terrorism. That is why Bush called it the Battle of Iraq in his May 2003 speech announcing the end of major combat operations there. It is why Bush went before the nation on September 7, 2003, and declared that the ongoing effort to pacify Iraq had become the central front of the war on terror. Bush's capacity to think about the most horrific threats and act decisively to prevent them from happening are both marks of the high seriousness with which he takes his constitutional responsibilities. They also speak to another energy in the executive quality that did not appear to be a hallmark of his character before he assumed the presidency: his daring. As a presidential candidate, Bush had been quite cautious, staking out his positions on a few important matters, hammering them home again and again, never trying to get too far out in front on any issue. He has conducted his presidency in a radically different manner. Bush will begin a public discussion by taking a breathtakingly ambitious posture, one far more ambitious than anybody expected him to take. The most notable example of this was his announcement that we would make no distinction between the terrorists who attacked us on September 11th and those who harbor them. This immediately broadened and widened the war. With those words, Bush changed the nature of the worldwide discussion of terrorism forever. He has been as bold in pursuing certain domestic policy matters. Twice, he has presented Congress with tax cut packages vastly larger than Congress anticipated. He did not attempt to make the package politically palatable to his adversaries before introducing it. He said, in effect, "This is what the economy needs. Take it or leave it." In the end, in both cases, Bush did compromise, but not before the Hobson's choice he had placed before the House and Senate forced the fence-sitters to jump off the fence and grudgingly follow him. The energy in the executive Bush displays in advancing his own policy is creative, tactical, and strategic. He uses it to move his agenda forward. That's the creative part. By constantly being on the move, he forces his opponents into a reactive, defensive stance. That's the tactical part. And the discussion usually takes place on Bush's terms and in a frame of reference Bush has chosen for it. That's the strategic part. His presidential style is almost completely the reverse of Bill Clinton's. The 42nd President of the United States was daring in the way he pursued his personal hungers. But whenever Clinton tried to be bold in matters of policy, such as the mammoth healthcare plan designed by his wife Hillary, the results were usually disastrous. The cautious, careful, even timid Clinton was the victorious Clinton. He closely followed public opinion polls and tailored his policies to suit the public mood. By contrast, George W. Bush has remarkable self-discipline in his personal life. To a man, his close aides describe him as the most disciplined person they've ever known. When it comes to matters of policy, however, Bush has the instincts of a successful riverboat gambler, a poker player who wins most of the time by exerting the kind of self-control that a compulsive gambler cannot. The successful poker player chooses the hand he plays. Over the course of a long game, he will make it clear to other players that he's not a bluffer. He plays when he has the cards, and they had best understand this if they don't want to lose their shirts. But as the game progresses, he quietly and deliberately uses the authority he has established. Only after he has won for real and stayed away from losing hands does he begin to venture into the rarefied territory that separates the truly great poker players from others, the successful bluff. Bush showed his stuff in 2002 when it came to standing firm against Iraq. He played both the United States Congress and the United Nations Security Council with the skill of the Cincinnati Kid. In the case of the U.S. Congress, the administration let it be known that its lawyers believed the president could initiate military action against Iraq without a congressional war authorization. That idea caused a firestorm in Washington as Democrat after Democrat screamed in outrage. How could the president possibly consider going to war with Iraq absent a congressional resolution? They sputtered and hollered and fumed, whereupon the administration said, "Fine, you insist on a congressional war resolution? We'll take it." They had little choice but to give it to him. The gambler president found himself in a similar but far more difficult game with the United Nations Security Council. In September 2002, he laid out the case before the United Nations for forcibly disarming Iraq. His speech before the General Assembly posed a stark choice to the world body. Will the United Nations serve the purpose of its founding, or will it be irrelevant, he asked. The president got his way in part when the Security Council passed Resolution 1441 in November 2002, which declared Iraq in material breach of UN resolutions and warned Iraq of serious consequences if it continued to defy them. Serious consequences was a euphemism for war. Then came 5 months of diplomatic sabotage on the part of France, Germany, and Russia. These three nations had voted in favor of 1441, and yet they were intent on undermining the resolution and the United States. They refused to allow a second resolution explicitly authorizing war to make it through the Security Council. Bush would have to go to war without a second resolution, relying only on the language of 1441 and the record of 16 United Nations resolutions violated by Saddam Hussein. His opponents at the UN wanted to see whether the president was bluffing. He certainly had been bluffing Congress when he suggested he might go to war without its approval. But he wasn't bluffing the United Nations. He would not allow the behavior of France, Germany, and Russia to stymie him. He stood at the head of a 33-nation coalition that supported the war, and he was not intimidated by the opinion of the so-called international community or tortured by the thought of going it alone. Finally, Bush has shown energy in the executive in the realm of rhetoric. Nothing about the Bush presidency has been more surprising than the brilliance, power, and intellectual seriousness of his speeches. Bush is intimately involved in the crafting of his speeches. He just hasn't felt the need to let it be known how seriously he takes the task. As a presidential candidate, Bush became famous or notorious for a condition some have dubbed dysverbia, his peculiar tendency to add unnecessary syllables to multisyllabic words. The demands and requirements of the presidency and his own comfort in the job have undeniably cured him of this bizarre condition. Bush has emerged as a genuinely great speaker. He has delivered at least half a dozen speeches that rank among the most powerful and important presidential addresses of the modern era. In a series of awe-inspiring remarks over 10 days that followed September 11, 2001, Bush knit America together in its grief, celebrated its determination, and concentrated its resolve. September 11th demanded nothing less, and Bush met and exceeded the challenge. In the months and years that have followed, he has expanded on the vision he displayed during those days in a series of speeches that have created a substantive framework for a new and complex foreign policy. And despite the know-nothing cavilling of those who say that the president is overly programmed and never says anything off the cuff, Bush often speaks from notes and not from a full text. That's especially true when he's traveling around trying to make the case for legislation on matters as various as Homeland Security, tax policy, and Medicare. Bush prefers to speak extemporaneously in these situations, proof of his hard-won confidence in his ability to frame the discussion. It pains me, a former speechwriter for Ronald Reagan, to say this, but I believe Bush is the best presidential speaker since Franklin Delano Roosevelt. It pains me even more to acknowledge that I was once one of those all-too-clever journalists who believed candidate Bush was lighter than a feather, the least prepared person to occupy the Oval Office in the modern era. He proved me wrong. George Bush will face the American people as a candidate for re-election in 2004, having constructed one of the most consequential presidencies in the nation's history. Now, according to those who, unlike me, maintain an unfavorable opinion of George W. Bush, he's done much, much more than that, all of it bad. His opponents and enemies accuse Bush of an endless series of crimes that began before he was president, when, in their view, he, quote, stole the 2000 election from Al Gore. Moreover, according to their indictment, things have only gotten worse since his arrival in the White House. Bush, they say, has actively sought the degradation of the environment. He has, they charge, staged an assault on American civil liberties. They believe his goal is to bankrupt the U.S. government with his tax cuts, which will simultaneously destroy the social safety net and make it impossible for future liberal presidents to institute new social programs. They claim he is isolating the United States from the rest of the world, supplanting international law and multilateral organizations in favor of a go-it-alone American arrogance. They charge that he is a cynical liar who knowingly used false intelligence to trick Americans into supporting an unnecessary war. Some of these criticisms, to be sure, grow out of standard partisan frustrations. They represent the thinking of Democrats who are unhappy that a Republican sits in the White House. Such people throw around arguments, accusations, and analyses to see if any of them will stick with the American people. Though much of what they say is unfair, that they should do so is all perfectly normal and rational. Welcome to Politics 101. But something besides mere partisan rancor is at work here. Bush's enemies aren't merely seeking electoral advantage against him. They have come to believe in the truth and substance of their criticisms. They actually think that this remarkably straightforward and straight-talking world leader, who pretty much does what he says he's going to do, is, in truth, a pathological liar. They are convinced that this follower of a mild branch of mainstream Protestant belief is a religious fanatic. They are certain that the president who has presided over an enormous increase in domestic government spending is actually out to destroy social welfare programs. And though, in fact, Bush has been obsessively concerned with the security and safety of American Muslims in the wake of the September 11th attacks, they do genuinely seem to believe that the president has been targeting ordinary Muslims for unprecedented civil liberties abuse. The allegations grow still wilder. Bush is accused of going to war in the Middle East to benefit the tiny state of Israel, serving Jewish interests rather than the interests of peace. The conservative demon of liberal fantasy may wear a Bush mask, but the real George W. Bush is a far more complicated figure ideologically, especially on certain hot-button conservative issues. Though gun owners are enthusiastic Bush supporters, he has continued to defy the wishes of the National Rifle Association by supporting a ban on assault rifles. On affirmative action, he personally directed his Justice Department not to argue for eliminating the use of race as a positive factor in college admissions when it made its arguments in two connected 2003 Supreme Court cases involving the University of Michigan. Bush has issued some of the most eloquent and moving anti-abortion rhetoric of any Republican. And yet he has made decisions on related issues that have made it clear he is in no way in the pocket of the pro-life movement. Pro-lifers wanted Bush to ban all research into stem cells because they fear research will inevitably